From Community Public Radio, this is the CPR News. From New York, I'm Don DeBar. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych has accepted the resignation of Prime Minister Nikolai Azarov and his cabinet, according to a decree on the presidential website. The cabinet will continue to work until a new government is formed. The Prime Minister submitted his resignation early Tuesday, explaining that the move was motivated by efforts to peacefully resolve the current crisis in the country. Also on Tuesday, 9 of the 12 anti-protest laws passed as a package on January 16th were repealed during a special session of the Ukrainian parliament. The repeal, one of the main demands of the opposition, was approved by 361 votes. Only 226 were needed. The laws banned unsanctioned gatherings and imposed multiple restrictions on mass demonstrations, making it illegal for protesters to wear masks or helmets or erect tents or stages without permits from the authorities. Most of the activities are illegal in most cities in the United States. The Parliament is also planning later on Tuesday to vote on a bill granting amnesty to participants of the mass protests. We'll have more on Ukraine later in the newscast. A suicide bomber from an al-Qaeda-linked rebel group killed 13 soldiers in an attack on the Syrian defense minister's hometown. A Saudi militant in Syria, fighting for the Nusra Front, blew himself up late Monday at an army checkpoint in the village of Rajan in central Hama province. Rajan, in a remote eastern part of Hama, is the ancestral home of Defense Minister Fahd al-Freij. In a news conference on the sidelines of the Geneva II conference Tuesday, Syrian Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad called on the United States and its allies to stop arming terrorist groups fighting against the Syrian government.
Everybody is aware that when the United States took its decision to stop providing weapons to the terrorist groups, that decision came after it was very clear that all the weapons given by the United States to the so-called moderate armed groups have gone to the extremist terrorist groups. But this proves again that the United States is not interested in the success of this process, and we believe the United States has to desist and stop its claims that it is interested in the success of this process.
After a high-level confab between the Prime Minister and the nation's election commission, the Thai government said elections set for this coming Saturday will be held on schedule. Cholafonza Narula reports from Bangkok.
Thai Election Commission officials met with Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra on Tuesday. Observers say pro-government candidates are virtually assured of winning the election. They say the decision to proceed may stem from Shinawatra's desire to prove her regime's legitimacy.
The government thinks that postponing the election will not solve anything. We have to proceed with the election on February 2nd in accordance with the royal decree.
The decision came after the country's constitutional court ruled that delaying the vote would be legal. But the court said both the Election Commission and the government needed to agree to any change of schedule. In response to the ongoing protest, Yingluck imposed a 60-day state of emergency in Bangkok and surrounding areas last week. But demonstrators continue to occupy major intersections in the capital. Advance voting had been scheduled to take place last Sunday, but it was suspended at 49 of the 50 polling places in Bangkok when demonstrators blocked the entrances. One person was shot dead and several others were injured in an apparent attack targeting demonstrators. Concerns were mounting over whether the election could be held safely. The recent round of demonstrations was triggered last November when Prime Minister Yingluck tried to get the parliament to pass a controversial amnesty bill. Members of the opposition reacted sharply. They said the bill would allow Yingluck's older brother, former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, to return to Thailand. He was ousted in a 2006 military coup and lives in self-imposed exile. Thaksin and Yingluck have strong support in rural areas in the north and northeast that have been left behind in Thailand's economic rise. Anti-Thaksin supporters come mostly from the urban middle class. Pro-Thaksin parties have won landslide victories since 2001. Protesters continue to demand that political reforms be implemented before elections are held. Tuesday's announcement means the demonstrations are likely to continue. I'm Chulapansa Narula in Bangkok.
Afghan President Hamid Karzai has suggested that U.S. forces may have aided or conducted shadowy insurgent-style attacks to undermine his government. This according to senior Afghan officials. The Washington Post reports that Karzai has formalized his suspicions with a list of dozens of attacks that he believes the U.S. government may have been involved in. The list even includes the recent bomb and gun assault on a Lebanese restaurant in Kabul, one of the bloodiest attacks targeting the international community in Afghanistan. That attack, which left 21 people dead, including 3 Americans, was almost universally attributed to the Taliban. But Karzai believes it was one of many incidents that may have been planned by Americans to weaken him and foment instability in the country. A senior palace official acknowledged that the government had no concrete evidence of U.S. involvement and that the American role had not been formally confirmed. We will be following this story as it develops. Regardless of how the power struggle in Ukraine shakes out, Russia will not renege on the agreements signed recently with its neighbor, President Vladimir Putin told a news conference in Brussels, referring to Russia's loan to its neighboring state and its offer to reduce gas prices. The loan and the gradual reduction of gas prices were to, quote, support the people of Ukraine, not the government. It's the ordinary people who always suffer, close quote. That according to Putin. The Russian president reiterated Moscow's position on the situation in Ukraine, saying that the political crisis in the country should be solved without foreign interference. We have this report from RT.
There were a lot of questions as to Russia's position politically, if in case the opposition in Ukraine does indeed take power. And this is what Vladimir Putin had to say on that matter.
Russia won't revise any credit agreements with the Ukrainian government, no matter who's heading it. We've never had any problems talking with all political powers in Ukraine. This has never been a taboo. What is important for us, though, is we want Kiev's economy to be creditworthy. We want it to be able to successfully restructure and develop.
He's also taking a very pragmatic approach. That's what he says as far as the economic policies of Ukraine is concerned, and also urged the international community that for those who were urging the leader Yanukovych to act in a civilized way, to ask the same of his opponents. Now, as we speak, the EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton is visiting Kiev, as well as they've had a visit before from other EU officials. And on this is what Putin had to say.
Russia is not going to interfere with Ukraine's affairs. I can imagine how our European partners would have reacted if, in the midst of the crisis in Greece or Cyprus, Russia's foreign minister turned up at one of the anti-EU rallies and addressed the people, urging them to do something. We believe it's not right. And considering relations between Russia and Ukraine, it is totally unacceptable.
Now, terrorism is a consistent topic of these meetings, and they said that they will continue cooperation in this. Russia saying that the Sochi anti-terror base was built on the partnership with the EU. They've also touched on Afghanistan as well as common concerns on Syria and Iran. Discussions are going to continue in the next Russia-EU summit on June the 3rd in Sochi.
Ukraine has been gripped by mass anti-government protests that began on November 21st after Yanukovych refused to sign an association agreement with the EU. Journalist Fernando Velasquez is the executive producer of Informativo Pacifica, a daily news program at Pacifica station KPFK in Los Angeles. He spoke with author and commentator Webster Griffin Tarpley about the situation in Ukraine.
As people probably know, Ukraine was one of the component Union republics of the USSR, the Soviet Union, and it was other than Russia, it was the one with the biggest population. And Ukraine is a site of considerable heavy industry in the eastern part of the country, the so-called Donbass, and it is one of the great wheat-producing areas of the world, the breadbasket of Russia and of Europe for many, many years. Ukraine is a country that was not really ever existed as a unified country, and it's composed of eastern parts where Russian is spoken, the Orthodox religion prevails, and the pro-Moscow attitudes are common, and then the western Ukraine were parts that were subjected to Austria-Hungary for about 130 years or so, and there we have Ukrainian language, which is separate, it's distinguishable, and at the same time a greater degree of orientation towards various forms of the Catholic Church, in other words, Rome and the Pope and other Western influences. Now, the recent history of Ukraine is very, very troubled. There was a color revolution organized by the CIA in 2004, which was the hijacking of an election and the ousting of President Yanukovych, the same man who is currently the president of Ukraine. And that color revolution installed a group of kleptocrats, NATO agents, IMF agents, in particular Yulia Tymoshenko, this blonde woman with the blonde pigtail, known as the gas princess, because she made her fortune selling the gas that really belonged to the people of Ukraine. So that color revolution was in 2004, and that regime essentially broke up with fighting among different gangs of thieves, with this Tymoshenko ending up in jail. And she deserves to be in jail. If anybody deserves to go to jail for corruption, it is the gas princess Yulia Tymoshenko. However, this area, of course, is hit very hard by the world economic depression, and the situation we now have it comes from the fact that the economy has not found a solution, and there's a difference of opinion between whether to orient towards the European Union or towards Moscow and the customs union that Putin is creating. I have to stress, though, that Ukraine was never invited to join the European Union. What the European Union was offering was essentially a kind of colonial status where Ukraine would become a source of super exploited foreign workers. It would become a dumping ground for merchandise that the European Union couldn't sell anywhere else. And there's also a great deal of interest on the part of wealthy Europeans to buy this tremendously productive land in the Ukraine, the Black Earth region, where some of the best wheat production in the world takes place. So at the end of all of this, basically to pick up the story last year, President Yanukovych was negotiating with the European Union, but at a certain point he realized that some of the conditions that Ukraine was being offered were worse than the African partners of the European Union. So this is a very, very bad deal, and Yanukovych decided to pull back. And at that point, the color revolution apparatus decided to occupy certain public squares in the middle of Kiev, the capital. However, it's not just the usual color revolution stuff that we've seen in other countries. Western Ukraine has a very significant presence of fascist and neo-Nazi organizations. And if you look at the history of these protests in Kiev, the right-wing extremist presence has been very great, and actually fascist and actually neo-Nazis. And this includes the political party, which is called Freedom, or Svoboda, is an anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi organization. They're very concerned about the veterans of the SS division called Galicia, right? The Waffen-SS of the Nazis had a group of Ukrainian volunteers that formed an actual fighting division. And quite a few of the people that you find in that square now in Kiev are the descendants, the sons or grandsons or whatever they are, and granddaughters of these pro-Nazi Ukrainians who fought against Stalin and the Soviets and in favor of Hitler. And the general tone of the people in that public square is that they hate Moscow, they hate Russians, they also hate Germans, and of course the anti-Semitism is extremely strong. So it's a very, very ugly group. But as you notice, the Western media have completely covered the fact that these are indeed neo-Nazis. I'll just give you one example. The head of the Svoboda Party, the Freedom Party, is a guy called Tyanybok. It's Tyahnybok. And if you look in the scholarly literature about European fascism in the past 10 or 20 years, he gets a significant part of the attention. In other words, he is a featured member of the fascist revival and racist and xenophobic revival that's going on in many parts of Europe. But Ukraine, it seems to be especially strong. One of the favorite slogans of this group is that Putin is secretly a Jew. This is the level of these people. So this is what the State Department and Secretary Kerry are now supporting. There's a certain division of labor involved. The European countries that are most directly involved are Poland, for historical reasons. Remember, Poland used to be a very big country. Poland used to go all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and that includes much of what is today Ukraine. So the Poles have an idea that they can reassert their dominance or influence over this part of the world, and at the same time, Sweden plays a role. Right? In Sweden, there's a so-called Baltic nobility, and a lot of them historically had holdings in what is now Ukraine, and some also Germany. Right? Germany probably, from the economic point of view, would like to colonize and loot Ukraine. So these are essentially the stakes. Now, the people in this public square, the so-called Maidan in Kiev, have been violent from the very beginning. In other words, this was always violent, and you've seen the films of these people beating police officers with clubs. You may have seen the Molotov cocktails being thrown by these demonstrators, and the policemen being set on fire and having to roll around to try to put the flames out. They use lasers to try to blind people. They use stun grenades and other things like this. So what you've had is that the demonstrators have occupied public buildings in a way that would never be permitted in other countries, and which really shouldn't be permitted. You don't want fascist gangs, for example, occupying your justice ministry or your foreign ministry or whatever it is, right? The presence in the squares is it's considerable, right? It's several tens of thousands of people, but you have to remember Ukraine has about 50 million people, and a lot of them are quite opposed to this. I would say clearly the majority, because these people represent chaos. It's also the case, though, that Yanukovych has been much too weak. It's a little bit similar to Syria, right? At the beginning of the Syrian destabilization, President Assad was very much afraid to use military force to crush the beginnings of this rebellion, because he was afraid of what the U.S. might do to him and so forth. And I think Yanukovych is the same story. He's been extremely timid, and the police, the Ukrainian police, have been beaten, burned, gassed, kidnapped, murdered by now. This is also demonstrated. So this has gone very far, and that has encouraged a lot of these fascist elements and others to come out of their woodwork and essentially take over government buildings in many parts of the western Ukraine and in some other parts of Ukraine.
President Obama is set to announce an executive order raising the minimum wage for some federal contract workers from $7.25 an hour to $10.10 an hour. Obama was scheduled to make the announcement during his State of the Union address Tuesday night. He's also expected to renew his push for immigration reform. Republican talking heads have been questioning the legality of the move. Facing a similar crisis of unemployment in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued 7 executive orders during the first 5 months of his presidency alone. In the first of these, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6101 on April 5, 1933, which established the Civilian Conservation Corps. Additional actions created public employment for millions of out-of-work Americans. We will have more details of President Obama's address in our newscast tomorrow. Activist and folk singer Pete Seeger died Monday at the age of 94. His family said he died of natural causes. Seeger was well known locally in the Hudson Valley region of New York as the man whose efforts to educate people about the environment led to the cleanup of the Hudson River. He was known around the world as the folk singer who stood up to the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s.
When the House Un-American Activities Committee wanted to know if you had political connections, you didn't want to answer, and that got you into some serious trouble.
This is because this group of people are actually, they're a group, in my opinion, a group of American fascists. Their idea of America is America where everybody agrees with them. Shira of Ohio was a supporter of the John Birch Society. Willis of Louisiana is a small town Mr. Big. He married the daughter of the local sugar mill owner, and his idea of America is that small town where everybody knows their place and he's on top.
Everybody's heard about taking the Fifth Amendment. You took the first.
I didn't actually take any. Later on, my lawyer said that the only defense he could make of me was on the basis of the first.
Which guarantees?
That's the one guaranteeing freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, and religion. The Fifth Amendment, in effect, is saying you have no right to ask me this question. But I wanted to say you have no right to ask any American citizen this question. And I was challenging them on this broader basis. And a year later, the Congress cited me for contempt, along with Dr. Otto Nathan, who was Einstein's friend, and Arthur Miller, the playwright. I was in good company. They were acquitted long before I was, but my trial didn't take place for 5 years later. I was convicted first, although it was a strange trial. The judge excused the jury every time we had one of our witnesses on there. We had Congressman Walter on the stand and asked him, are you acquainted with the people that run this blacklisting outfit called Aware Incorporated? They published red channels and so on. He said, no, I've never met the man. One day later, we have the head of Aware Incorporated on the stand, said, Quint, have you ever met Congressman Walter? He says, yes, I went down to Washington to see him. So he had a long interview with Walter. Well, there was Walter caught right in perjury, but the jury had been excused during all of that.
You were convicted and sentenced to
a year in jail, but a year later I was acquitted by the appeals court.
A veteran of the labor, peace, and civil rights movements, Seeger remained relevant as an activist into his 90s. He was also active in the movement for clean, sustainable energy. Solar power advocate Harvey Wasserman sent us this clip of Pete singing with Dar Williams and others about solar power.
300 years ago, Sir Thomas More invented the word utopia, where everything was going to be hunky-dory. But now we know it's going to be a green-powered Earth, and that'll be Solartopia. Was there an Adam? Was there an Eve? Or did we evolve from what we conceived? Either way, we got what we needed when the sun shone down on the Garden of Eden.
Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia, Solartopia, Solartopia. Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia all over God's green world?
Well, we bit that apple and the garden was lost, and so we had to work to pay the cost. And so we went digging into the ground and started to burn many things we found. But
don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia, Solartopia, Solartopia. Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia all over God's green world?
Well, we multiplied, we needed more. The rich got rich, the poor got sore. The fuel ran scarce, the price jumped high, and so they gave nuclear power a try. But
don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia, Solartopia, Solartopia. Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia all over God's green world?
But the nuclear plants were built in haste, with too many risks and no place for waste. And so from Seabrook to Shoreham town, we have to shut those new plants down. But
don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia, Solartopia, Solartopia. Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia all over God's green world?
He was also widely known as the founder and sponsor of the annual Clearwater Festival on the shores of his beloved Hudson River. We close with this piece by Holly Near, delivered at the 2006 Clearwater Festival.
We are gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. And that night, people sang, "We are gay and lesbian people singing for our lives." And for many people out in the streets, it was the first time they'd said those words out loud about themselves. And then the song flew out around the world, and it started getting sung by people in many countries, different verses being added. The English and Irish women sang it when they marched together for peace. It was sung in Latin America. People have told me they've heard it when they were in prison in Latin American jails. It even found its way into the Unitarian hymnal. But a song takes wings and it has a life of its own. And so then allies began to change the verse and they said, "We are gay and straight together." And then a number of years went by and we learned more about sexuality than we had known before, and now I can't fit all the words into the meter of the song. But maybe the time has come that we've become more sophisticated over the last 40, 50 years of social change movements. It was really necessary to separate a little bit, for us to learn about ourselves and not feel all put into some sort of sameness. And now we can bring what we learned about our difference back into the circle. We are all in this together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are all in this together, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
And that's all the news we have for you right now. For Community Public Radio, I'm Don DeBar in New York. Thanks for listening.